Good morning and welcome to Washington Journal for Monday, August 17th, 2015. Well, next up, hear from Michael Farris. He is the co-founder of a group, the Convention of the States Project. He's joining us to talk about their grassroots effort to amend the Constitution.
Washington Journal continues.
Joining us is Michael Farris, who is co-founder of the Convention of the States Project, here to talk to us about their efforts to amend the U.S. Constitution. Tell us what prompted you to get behind this effort.
Well, I've been working around government for about 3 decades, and specifically here in Washington, D.C., and I became convinced that the combination of big cities, big media, and big government in Washington meant that the grassroots efforts to try to lower the amount of government coming from this place, the debt, the spending, the regulation, the burden of big government on us, will never be solved inside this city. That if we're going to do that, we needed to go outside of Washington, and the only way to do a structural change is through Article 5 of the Constitution to limit the power of the federal government.
Let's, as a starting point for this conversation with our viewers and listeners, take a look at the fifth article of the Constitution and what Mr. Farris is talking about. The fifth article says that Congress, on the application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call for a convention proposing amendments which shall be valid to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution when ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of the several states or by conventions in 3/4 thereof. It also says it takes 34 states to, it would now take 34 states to call a convention of the states. 36 states have filed, the legislature have filed in 2015, and this effort has passed in 4 states, Georgia, Alaska, Alabama, and Florida. Define this term, convention of the states. What's different between a convention of the states and an actual constitutional convention?
Well, a convention of the states is as opposed to a Congress, means you come together and it's one state, one vote. And it's for a particular purpose. There have been over 30 conventions of states in the history of the American Republic. About 2/3 of those prior to the Constitution, and about 1/3 since the Constitution. And the nature of a convention of the states is you get together for a single subject, and you discuss that subject, and you come out with a proposal that is relevant to that. And so for the Constitution, they came together for the purpose of completely revising the government. Here, it's coming together for particular amendments, because you can't, there have been 400 applications for a convention, and we've never had a convention of the states because we've never had 2/3 for the same subject matter. So the starting point is you have to have 2/3 of the states say, we want a convention for this purpose. And the purpose that we're asking for is a convention to impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, and impose term limits on federal officials. It doesn't mean all those things will survive the process, but it means those are the things that can be lawfully discussed at the convention.
Why wouldn't you do these things through the normal amendment process to the Constitution?
There is no way in the world that Congress will propose any amendments that limit the power of Washington, D.C., particularly the power of Congress. This city has one motto that is truly bipartisan: increase Washington's power, increase Washington's influence.
When was the last time the Constitution was amended?
Well, the 27th Amendment was adopted in the 1990s. Of course, it was proposed as part of the original Bill of Rights. So that's kind of an anomaly. Before that, it was the 18-year-old vote amendment.
Michael Farris is our guest. We're talking about amending the Constitution, his group's effort to call a convention of the states to address some of the issues he just talked about. Here's how you can join the conversation. For Republicans, the number is 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. And for all others, 202-748-8002. And send us a tweet at C-SPAN WJ. We'll also look for your comments on Facebook as well. Headline in the Wall Street Journal, in the Washington Times says backers of Constitutional Convention are stepping up the campaign. What's involved in the campaign to call this convention?
Well, our efforts are involving trying to get enough grassroots participants to have at least 100 people in 3/4 of the state house districts of the country. There are 4,000 state house districts in the 40 states or so that are our primary targets. And if we can get 100 people in 75% of those districts, we believe that that kind of grassroots pressure will allow state legislators to feel free to vote in favor of a convention of the states and get it called. Our hope is that this will be done in a couple of years. It's not going to take 6 months. It's not going to take 10 years. We hope that in about 2 years from now we'll be seeing a convention of the states.
Has the effort to call a convention of the states ever been undertaken? You say we've never had a convention of the states, correct? Has anybody ever tried to call a convention of the states?
Oh, lots of times. There have been, like I say, 400 applications. But an organized grassroots approach has not been really done very much. It's mostly been more inside politics, where a group of state legislators will say, let's try to do this or let's try to do that. And it's not enough political punch in an effort that's only state legislators. You need both legislators and grassroots participants to make something like this a reality.
Is the situation in what is the situation in American legislatures these days? Who controls the majority of the legislatures?
If you count Nebraska, which is officially nonpartisan, but if you count it as a Republican state, which is the reality, there are 32 states where the Republicans control both houses of the legislature. There are an additional 6 states where the Republicans and the Democrats each have a house, and then there are 11 states. My number is off by 1. There are 11 states where the Democrats control both houses. So it's 32 plus 7 plus 11, and that gets you to the 50.
We mentioned the 4 states that currently have passed the call for the convention of the states: Georgia, Alaska, Alabama, and Florida, all controlled by Republicans?
Correct. We were able to pass it in a single house in 10 or 11 other states this past year. Some of those are split states, like Iowa. We passed it in the Iowa House this year, didn't get it through the Iowa Senate. There's a party shift from the House to the Senate, but we're hopeful that we're going to be able to do that.
Is there a time limit to this? Once it passes a legislature, is that good for a year or two, or is it?
It's good forever, unless one of 2 things happen. Either the legislature rescinds its application, or they put a time limit within the application itself. If they do that, then it expires according to its own terms.
We have calls from Michael Farris on amending the U.S. Constitution. We go first to Ron, who's in Andrews, North Carolina. Go ahead.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Farris. This sounds like a great idea. What can the ordinary citizen do to get behind this to help you get this underway?
Well, you can sign up on our website, conventionofstates.com, and we really need help in North Carolina. We had committee hearings this year in North Carolina. I came and testified there in those committee hearings, and if there's enough grassroots backing, North Carolina is a state that really should pass the Convention of States. And we came pretty close in getting the votes there, but they weren't quite there, so we pulled back. We're waiting for this next year.
List us your top priorities again on what you'd like to see passed at a Convention of the States, the issues addressed.
Limiting the power of federal spending by fixing the General Welfare Clause, limiting the power of federal regulation by fixing the Commerce Clause, balanced budget, and some kind of realistic checks and balances on the federal courts, particularly the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has said approximately 20 times that there's no realistic check on their power other than their own internal sense of self-restraint. And something, either term limits or some kind of legislative override, something needs to be done where there's better checks and balances on the Supreme Court.
To our Democrats line in California, Riverside, it's Bonnie. Welcome.
Oh, thank you. I was thinking when he first started and he was saying he was going to amend something, I thought he was going to say amend the Citizens United or something about the Congress representing the people rather than the corporations. When somebody says less government, to me, that means bigger corporations. And with this TPP passing, this would give them enormous control over everything and everybody. But you know what? God's in control, so whatever happens, He's in charge. Thank you very much.
Well, I certainly agree that God's in control ultimately, but the way to get money out of Washington, D.C. and get money out of politics, corporate welfare is not good for this country. The kind of corruption that we see going on through the financial practices is because people can make money here in Washington, D.C. by regulating. Is where spending and regulation is located in Washington, D.C., then there's money to be made. If we fix the general welfare clause and we fix the commerce clause and have those decisions dispersed throughout the country, the ability to manipulate the process efficiently goes away, and the ability of big corporations to run this country effectively goes away. And so the diffusion of power really will help the problem that it lies at the heart of Citizens United.
David's next. He's in Flemington, New Jersey. Independence Line. Good morning.
Thank you for taking my call. My understanding is that pay, benefits, pensions for all public employees, state, federal, county, local, whatever, is constitutionally protected. And considering the financial status of so many states, if this is true, I think that constitutional protection should be eliminated.
Well, that would be a matter of state constitutional law, not federal constitutional law. There was an Illinois decision on that subject, and that was the decision. There was a state constitutional protection. I'm not aware of any other state having that. If there is, it's very rare, and so there's certainly not a federal constitutional provision on that point. But pension reform, government pension reform, has to be a part of balancing the budget and getting the problem under wraps. We're not going to see this country get fiscally sound if we think that the problem is $18 trillion. It's more like $100 trillion when you consider what we owe people that we've taken out of the Social Security Trust Fund, Medicare, Medicaid. The unfunded mandates are even far greater than the stated national debt.
David, are you still in line? Any follow-up to that?
Yeah, yes, I'm still online. So what I understand your guest is saying is that it's state by state, but it's very rare that a state actually protects public employees' pay and benefits and pensions.
As a matter of state constitutional law, yes, that's rare. Now, politically, it'd be a very difficult thing to undo pension plans. And in fairness to people, you need to wind these things down. If you're going to change the benefits for people, you can't do it to somebody who's 59 years old. You've got to start over and say, okay, if you're 25 years old now, your plan is going to be different when you come out on the other side. But you've got to treat people fairly that have been relying on the system for a long time.
I want to talk about some of the groups opposing your effort. Reform groups strongly oppose efforts in states to call a constitutional convention. And looking at the statement of the group Democracy 21, they released a statement that says, thus the call for a convention would place all of the constitutional rights and protections of individuals up for grab. This includes protections that exist for civil rights, civil liberties, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, voting rights, privacy, and many others. What's your response to that?
That's the same position taken by the John Birch Society. It's the nutcases on either end that take that viewpoint. There's just no law behind it. We have, again, 400 applications for a convention of the states that says you have to have an agreement on the subject matter. And I actually litigated the case that's on the other side of that. Can you change the rules in the middle of the stream? The Equal Rights Amendment, they were originally given 7 years for ratification, and then Congress purported to change the rules for ratification in the middle of the stream. I filed the first lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of that change of process on behalf of Washington state legislators more than 30 years ago. And we won that case, and the rule from the federal district court was you can't change the rules in the middle of the stream. So if you have to have an agreement on the subject matter to start with, and you can't change the rules in the middle of the stream, then this fear-mongering going from the extreme left and the extreme right is just nonsense. And the power of the convention is no different than Congress. You can call a convention for a particular purpose. Congress can propose amendments for a particular purpose. Just because Congress proposes an amendment on minimum wage or Citizens United doesn't mean the whole Constitution's up for grabs. It is an amendment-focused process.
You're a constitutional lawyer.
I am.
How many times have you argued before the Supreme Court?
Just once. I've filed lots of briefs, but I've only argued one time.
Do you ever think about why the founders put Article 5 in there? What was behind their thinking or their writing about this clause in the Constitution?
Oh, it was very important to the adoption of the Constitution. It's clear that the Massachusetts convention would not have ratified the Constitution but for Article 5, because they knew that the process wasn't perfect. And the reason they gave us this form of Article 5, as George Mason said at the Constitutional Convention, we'll never get a proposal that limits the power of the federal government out of Congress. You only will get a proposal limit federal power from the states. And so they wanted checks and balances, not just vertical checks and balances, but horizontal checks and balances. The ultimate political power in this country is the ability to lawfully change the Constitution. And only the state legislatures can lawfully change the Constitution by themselves. Now, it takes an overwhelming majority to do that. But the state legislatures all by themselves can propose amendments and ratify amendments, and Congress only has a ministerial role in the whole process.
You need 34 states to do that. A couple of those have got to
Right.
be Democratic-controlled legislatures. What's your selling point to those legislatures in those states?
The decrease of federal power is an increase of the power of the people and the power of the states. This should be a bipartisan issue. When we make presentations, like in Berkeley, California, we ask the people in Berkeley, who do you want making decisions for Berkeley? Do you want Berkeley making the decisions, or Sacramento making the decisions, or do you want Washington, D.C.? And whether you're in Pocatello, Idaho, or Berkeley, everybody says, no, we want to make more of our decisions locally. And that's what this really is about decentralizing power and letting California be California, and letting Idaho be Idaho, and Wyoming be Wyoming.
On the West Coast, on our Democrats line, Seattle is next. Chad, hello there.
This guy just sounds like abject stupidity. That means, like, say, if you would have less federal government, you wouldn't have EPA regulation. No, the states would do that. You would all go to hell. And that's what I think people like this want. They want everything just to go to hell. I don't buy. I think this is pure evil. I don't buy that, I think the federal government should be stronger. I think we should have more of a socialist federal government. I think it's just evil to think the states can fend for themselves.
Well, he wants a socialist government, so that reveals his perspective. And to a person who wants a socialist government, it probably doesn't make a lot of sense. But the EPA issue in Seattle area, for example, Boeing is facing real problems, real job layoffs, because the EPA has adopted a fish eating standard to Washington State eats more fish per capita than almost any other state. And so they have higher mercury discharge levels. And so they're losing jobs in Seattle. The jobs are threatened in Seattle with Boeing Airplane Company because the people there aren't able to get equal treatment by the EPA. I think Washington State legislature could pass just a very appropriate environmental protection for the state of Washington. We don't need the EPA to make edicts for Washington State. Washington State can do it all by itself.
Here's Dave, who's in Lake Zurich, Illinois, independent line.
Yes, sir. Thanks for taking my call. Are you familiar with Article 26
Article 26 of what?
of the Constitution?
There is no Article 26 of the Constitution. There's 7 articles of the Constitution. There are 27 amendments. So if you mean Amendment 26.
Yeah, Amendment 26. I'm sorry.
Okay. What about it?
I'm not a constitutional attorney.
Okay.
It's all right.
I'm a citizen here.
All
Go
right,
ahead, Dave.
Okay. Well, what about
You're
it?
familiar with that?
Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to make note that, unless the public really gets angry, nothing happens. The people in power, especially the attorneys that come out of a law school, need to feel their power here. This article, this proposed amendment sent to the states March 23rd, 1971, was the fastest ratified amendment, because the kids of the day who were not 21 could not vote but still be drafted. My generation, and I'm a veteran of the Vietnam era, had to riot, had to start to destroy schools that were so concerned about control. You can't vote, but you can get drafted. I can go die for the great legislators who come up with this stuff, but I can't vote. Because of this action is the only way that any legislators, any place, will move, was when the grassroots action becomes so powerful that their own livelihoods are put at stake. Do you agree with that?
Well, I agree absolutely that grassroots action is the key, and the 26th Amendment, the 18-year-old vote amendment, if I'm recalling it correctly, Jerry Springer had a lot to do with that. He made it popular, but it's grassroots activity. That's exactly right. And if people think that Washington, D.C. has aggrandized way too much of its own power and is building up its power base to the detriment of both the people and the states, then we need grassroots activists to come help us to dismantle this. ConventionOfStates.com is the way that they can connect with us.
Orlando, Florida next. It's Gene on a Republican line. Hello there.
Hi. My question is, when this convention is called, how do you envision it would operate? How would it really organize itself and do the things that it has to do?
We have a draft set of rules that we're circulating among state legislators right now, but the principal rule is this: it's one state, one vote. That's the nature of a convention of states as opposed to a Congress. A Congress, it's the individual delegates vote. In a convention of states, states vote. One state, one vote. And that's the central organizing principle. I hope it will be organized someplace in the middle of the country. That would be symbolically very helpful. Any place besides Washington, D.C. is okay with me.
Anything to keep that convention of the states from veering into off the topics that you're calling it for, balanced budget, money out of Washington and other issues. How do you keep it from amendments being proposed by states that weren't part of the original plan?
Well, first of all, the rules will say it would be non-germane to do that. And then but you know, theoretically, people could vote to amend the rules. But the political forces that brought the convention, the 34 states that called the convention, will all be coming with instructions. You stick to this topic. And so those delegates from 34 states, which is way more than enough to keep the thing in order, will be under instructions to stay to the subject matter. And so the other 16, 17, whatever number of states it is that don't have instructions wouldn't be able to carry the day. Ultimately, you could file lawsuits. I filed a lawsuit challenging the constitutionality when Congress changed the rules. We could file a lawsuit if delegates tried to change the rules as well. So the rules will be called, it'll be called for a particular purpose. And you have to stick to that purpose.
Our guest is Michael Farris, who is the co-founder of the group Convention of the States Project, which is calling for a convention of the states to address constitutional issues. Welcome your calls and comments. We go to Steve in Robertsville, Missouri, Democrats line. Hi, Steve.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I just wanted to say I spotted this fraud right off the bat as soon as he come up there and said this is deregulation on everything. And that's the whole problem. We need regulation on everything. I mean, we got an out-of-control government. And, you know, it's like Donald Trump talking about Ronald Reagan, how great he was. Well, Ronald Reagan deregulated everything. He lowered the taxes on the rich. And he said, we're going to close the border in 1986. Well, it never happened because they got cheap labor. So this is all a fraud, and that's all I got to say. Thank you very much.
The caller's self-conflicted because he says the government's out of control, but we need more regulation. Regulation doesn't regulate government, basically. Regulation regulates private people. And that's the problem that we have in the country is there's too much regulations, too many conflicting regulations. The basic genius of the founders was that one level and only one level of government should deal with each issue. And if we achieve that, sure, we need some regulations, sure, we need some laws, but do we need conflicting laws? Do we need a federal law, local law, and state law on every issue, or can we get by with just one level of government regulating roads, one level of government regulating education, one level of government regulating wage and prices?
Welcome your comments on Twitter as well. At C-SPAN WJ, here are a couple. This one says, needed a totally new constitution in line with new realities. If it is broken, do not fix it. Steve says, I'm for Convention of the States to fix the Constitution. Rewriting the Second Amendment is long overdue, one of many. That's not in your purview what your group is calling for. Bill King says the federal government needs to be more powerful. You cannot have 50 different state laws on marriage, abortion, or marijuana. One more here who says, yes, we need a Convention of the States ASAP. Let's go back to our calls in San Marcos, Texas. It's Zenos on our Republican line. Texas, good morning. Go.
Hi.
Zenos, hi.
I'd just like to clarify a couple of things. First of all, I think it's great what he's doing. And second of all, I'm from New York, but I live in Texas. I think that anything that takes more power away from the federal government is good. That being said, I think we need a few basic laws at the federal level that regulate all of the states. But I've seen, for example, in Arkansas, they have terrible roads. But in other states, they have perfectly smooth highways all over the place. So I can get that there's a certain level of difference between each state in the way that it runs things. But I think we need more power given to the individual and not corporations, which for some reason are defined as people.
Well, the biggest benefit for limited government is that it increases the power of the people. The more government power and control we have, the less freedom we have. And so freedom is really the ultimate objective of any effort to limit government power. The rights of the people, I'm a First Amendment and Fourth Amendment litigator, what I do day in and day out. And if we are going to protect the rights of the people, then making sure that we have a limited government. The reason the founders thought we didn't need a Bill of Rights, at least the Federalists thought we didn't need a Bill of Rights, is they said the federal government is so limited in its power, it can't possibly intrude into the rights of the people. And we see with an all-powerful federal government, it's why we're spying on our own citizens, why we're abusing the rights of the citizens daily, is because we have too powerful of a federal government.
Does your group see any need to change any of the amendments in the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments?
No, they would not be germane.
Here's Grand Rapids, Michigan. Michael, good morning. Democrats line.
Yes, good morning. To me, this is just a move to move us back to the issues of the Civil War. And of course, we all know that during the Civil War, states' rights denied minorities any rights at all. I think the federal government's role is to make sure that we are all treated equally. And under this proposal, there is no equality. Each state can do whatever they want to do with the lesser of the peoples, the minorities and the poor.
Well, that's not true under our application. I guess it's theoretically possible to write an application that would impact the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, but not ours. Our application is there to limit the power of the federal government to spend too much money, to regulate businesses, to regulate jobs, to go into so much debt, where the Supreme Court has no checks and balances on its power. And so, you know, if anything is possible, then, you know, I guess you could, you know, if somebody wrote an application for a wide open convention, then, you know, you could talk about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. But the politics of that are such, there is no votes in this country for touching any of those things. We have to deal with political reality. You know, it is theoretically possible that President Obama could nominate me for the next vacancy on the Supreme Court. The political chances of that happening are zero. And people don't go walking around saying, oh no, what could happen if Mike Farris gets appointed by President Obama? No, we live in political reality. We can count votes. And if we count votes and see what's realistic possible, it is possible to trim the power of the federal government a bit. It is possible to trim the regulations a bit. It's possible to have a little bit of a check and balances on the Supreme Court. Any dramatic move one direction or another is not possible. But I think it's time that we go in a very strong direction, as far as we possibly can, in limiting some of the power of Washington, increasing the rights of the people, and increasing the responsibility of the states.
On that previous caller's view of state versus federal rights or obligations, Grace on Twitter agrees with that caller, tweeting that the federal government needs to control civil rights law, not the states. Otherwise, we'd be back to slavery in some states and back to the Civil War. Michael Farris, I want to ask specifically about your efforts in some of the states. An article from earlier this year, Washington Post headline says some Virginia Republicans want to amend the U.S. Constitution. The party is split in the way, and a big sign says no Article 5 convention. They write that earlier this year, conservative legislators fed up with Washington are pushing a measure meant to rein in federal spending and power, but they face fierce opposition from fellow conservatives. Right. What's the status of your effort in Virginia?
Well, Virginia, we had the votes to pass it in the Virginia House of Delegates, but we were one vote short in the Senate. In the Senate, there's a one vote margin between the Republicans and the Democrats. And so there were two Republicans who were on the wrong side of the issue, one of whom is retired, the other whom is my own senator, Dick Black. And they were listening to the John Birch Society. The John Birch Society preaches all this runaway convention nonsense. They also teach that the Constitution was illegally adopted in the first place, which is historically inaccurate if you just go and read the basic history. But nonetheless, the fear-mongering that goes on is a real obstacle. We think we're going to get there. We need to switch 2 votes in the Virginia Senate, and then we'll be able to pass it.
Here's Bob in Philadelphia on the independent line.
Good morning, gentlemen.
Morning.
I have a comment and I have a question. The comment is, I think this is a great idea, and if you hold it, you should hold it in Philadelphia at the Constitution Center, which is the birthplace of this country. That's my comment. My question is, you said it's one state, one vote. With that being said, if you have a state that's, say, 90% liberal, does that mean conservatives do not have a voice? So if it was 2 votes, a Democrat and a Republican, then everybody has a voice. I think that might be a better way to go. It's a fairer way to go. What do you think?
Well, even though it's one state, one vote, every state will have multiple delegates. And so the state legislature gets to decide the methodology and the apportionment of the delegates. And I think that some sort of representation of the state's political makeup is likely in many of the states. But the reality is you'll caucus. Let's say Pennsylvania has 9 delegates, and let's say it's 6 Republicans and 3 Democrats, just to make up numbers. That would be some sort of representation. But then at the Pennsylvania would caucus on each of the issues. And I don't think every issue would be a straight partisan issue. I think there'll be some bipartisan matters that will be discussed. So that will be the way the system works, and it reflects more bipartisanship and more diverse forms of power than you might think right at first.
Yeah, Locust Grove, Virginia is next. Speaking of Virginia, let's hear from Eugene, Democrats line.
Good morning.
Morning.
Something you said earlier about striking at the foundation of Citizens United. It seems to me that for years now, big money has been electing their representatives in states. That's why we have such a skewed what do you call it? The voting, you know, I mean, it's really unbalanced in many of the states. My concern is that what we'd be doing is weakening the government, not benefiting it, and the states would be more easier affected by big money than the current government actually is. I think the best way to clean up the federal government would be to get somebody in place that is been honest, that has got no ties to big money, somebody like Bernie Sanders. I think there is a solution.
Well, the reality is the cost of a U.S. Senate race and the cost of a Virginia state Senate race are worlds apart, not just a little bit apart, worlds apart. And that's because big money knows that the vast majority of money to be made is in Washington, D.C. And so if we take away the financial incentive where most domestic spending is shifted away from Washington, D.C. Into the states, then there will be a reallocation of power, but it'll be diffuse in nature. And the ability of the people to control the elections, just go try to make an appointment to visit your U.S. senator, or go to try to make an appointment to visit your state senator. It is so much easier to visit your state and local representatives, and the money is not there. I don't know what experience the caller has, but I've been around state and federal government for a long, long time. And big money plays a huge role in Washington, D.C. It is much, much more muted at the state level.
I want to ask about the opinion piece you wrote in the Daily Caller called, titled The Supreme Court Redefining Marriage is proof we need an Article 5 convention. Explain that to us.
Well, the purpose of self-government is that the elected officials make the law. We should make the constitutional law, we should make the statutory law. And that is, because we don't like the law that gets made, we can vote the rascals out. You can't vote the Supreme Court out. And the people will say, and have said hundreds of thousands of times, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage. Well, that's exactly what happened. But they're not supposed to legalize anything. Correctly stated, the people who wrote the 14th Amendment legalized same-sex marriage. But if you put those words out on a table, there's no way in the world that the people who wrote the 14th Amendment wrote the words that ended up meaning that we should have same-sex marriage. We can do it state by state. If the people want to vote it in, fine, let the people vote it in. If the legislators want to vote it in, let the legislators vote it in. But the question is, who decides? Most of these issues boil down to who should make these decisions. And we don't believe that unelected officials should be able to make such nation-changing kind of decisions as the Supreme Court made in that case. Whichever side of the case that came down, the Supreme Court shouldn't make that decision. The elected people should make the decision.
How does the Constitution currently define the role of the Supreme Court?
The Supreme Court defines the role of the Supreme Court as being the only one that can interpret the Constitution of the United States. And I was involved in writing the federal RFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And in Bernie versus Flores, which was the follow-up case to RFRA, they ruled RFRA to be unconstitutional on the federal level, or excuse me, on the state level, because only the Supreme Court can interpret the Constitution of the United States. That's a pretty different thing than saying the Supreme Court's the final interpreter of the Constitution to saying the Supreme Court's the only interpreter of the Constitution. I just think that that's a very dangerous place for us to be, where 9 lawyers get to decide what this nation stands for in so many areas where the people have never voted on it.
More calls for Michael Farris. Hogansville, Georgia is next. Independence line. Mike, go ahead.
Good morning. I too am a veteran that was drafted and served before we had the opportunity to vote. I also take exception to the gentleman referring to people who disagree with him as the lunatic fringe, and I strongly take exception to him and his organization that are doing nothing but trying to circumvent the Constitution that we veterans swore to uphold and defend. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I didn't say that anyone who opposes me is lunatic fringe. I say the people who make the argument that the constitutional provision of Article 5 will automatically result in a runaway convention. The extreme left and the extreme right are the ones who make that argument. There is no law, there's no policy, there's no political reality behind that. And so that particular argument is the argument of the lunatic fringe. I'll stand by that. But there are other people who oppose this. You know, if they want a bigger federal government, well, then they should oppose this. People who want the Supreme Court to have no checks and balances, then they should oppose this. And those are not lunatic fringe positions. Those are responsible positions. I don't agree with those positions, but that's different than saying the Constitutional Convention is a runaway convention, is going to change the Second Amendment, we're going to bring slavery back. Those kind of arguments are not responsible arguments.
Joe's in Dakotas, Florida, on our Democrats line for Michael Farris. Welcome.
Good morning. I was pleased to hear you talk just a couple of callers ago about the people who wrote the 14th Amendment. In my opinion, there's one thing in the 14th Amendment that really needs to be changed, and it wasn't designed for this purpose, and that is for people who get around the legal immigration laws by visiting the United States, foreign nationals dropping a baby to become a citizen. I know that the framers did not intend for that to happen, and I would love to see that changed.
Well, the whole issue of birthright citizenship that is addressed in the 14th Amendment is something that Congress can legislate about. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment gives Congress the power to enforce the provisions of that article by appropriate legislation. And so you could pass, Congress could legitimately pass laws that eliminate the so-called anchor baby provisions and other provisions, but by making sure that the person who's giving birth has a legitimate attachment to the United States as a condition to getting birthright citizenship. That could be done if there's the votes to do it. That's not something that needs to be addressed at the constitutional level, and it's not something that we're seeking to address because that would change the power of the federal government and in a way that where the federal government needs to be in power. The federal government needs to have the sole jurisdiction over immigration. That shouldn't be diverse through the states.
So that could have a legislative solution?
Absolutely.
Donald Trump, in his position paper released over the weekend on immigration, calls for as well an end to birthright citizenship. From that paper, they write that the nation, this remains the biggest magnet for illegal immigration by 2-to-1 margin. Voters say it's the wrong policy, including Harry Reid, who said, quote, no sane country would give automatic citizenship to the children of illegal immigrants. And again, would this come up in your convention of the states?
No, that's outside the scope of what we're trying to accomplish.
Let's hear from Jim, who's in Park Hills, Missouri. Jim, go ahead. Good morning.
Good morning to you. My issue is, I guess I might be one of them fear mongers. The Constitution was wrote, and we just keep adding to it the things that, and it makes it difficult to even understand for normal people. The lawyers, you can hear the lawyer talk, you know, the words that they use, the color of law, things like that. The American people are so confused and so upset with the government now, and we call it a government. Actually, it's a corporation. And you talk about money. This money, you know, trying to control the money. The money we have in this country is not real money. It's not backed by anything. So what kind of issues are you going to bring up with the Constitution with that? That was, you know, because we got fiat money. And, you know, the American people, I think, are, and I say people, I don't say citizens because that's a word that lawyers use. But anyway, the thing I got is about the money.
We'll get a response. Thanks, Jim.
Well, the ability of the federal government to create money out of thin air is an issue that worries a lot of people, and it's something that could be addressed at the convention that we're talking about. Most people are concerned about the ability to spend money that we don't have. The whole debt issue, spending money that somebody thinks is a good idea, and we never give consideration. Do we have the resources to do this? And I think that becoming fiscally responsible is an absolute essential factor if we're going to retain the liberty of this country. I have a lot of kids, a lot of grandkids, and I simply believe that they will be economic slaves if we don't get this spending, out of control spending, under control. So the biggest issue on money is to stop the abusive federal spending and saying we got to live within our means.
One final comment on Twitter. Limited government doesn't limit upward mobility. Tweet says it is the elite and tribal caste that owns government that protects their own. Here's the question for you. There's no bipartisanship now in the federal government. I don't have much faith that representatives to a convention of states would be much different. How about you?
Well, it's bipartisan on what issue? And that is the issue of how much power should Washington, D.C. have. And so the founders pitted the states against the federal government for the very purpose of believing the states would try to limit federal power. And so we shouldn't be thinking Republican and Democrat. We should be thinking Washington and regular America. And this is a time for regular America to rise up and to say, we need to limit Washington's power. That's the bipartisanship that matters. It's regular America against Washington, and I think regular America needs to stand up, speak up, and show up and limit the power of Washington, D.C.
Viewers and listeners can find out more at conventionofstates.com.
That's right.
And you're on Twitter at COS Project. Michael Farris, thanks so much for joining us this morning on Washington Journal.
Thank you, Bill.